The irony isn't lost on me. The year I decided to start a project documenting my experiences gardening through the tremendously hot and dry summers, typical to the Sacramento Valley, the region experienced is the mildest summer I can remember since we moved here from northern New England nearly a decade ago. While we have experienced a few heat waves so far this summer, where daytime highs topped out in the 105 to 108 range for a few days in a row, the summer has so far been pretty bearable. It's been hot, but just normal hot, not apocalyptic hot like it's been for much of the American Southwest this year. That said, over the last few years, I've learned a lot about helping a veggie garden survive and thrive in a place where it's hot, bright, and bone dry from May to late October. None of the methods in this video are particularly revolutionary or mind blowing, but they are common sense countermeasures that have acted as game changers in our little backyard garden. Admittedly, I'm not sure how effective any of these methods would be in the face of absolutely pavement melting heat, like much of the US is currently enduring. Apparently, the heat in Arizona is actually killing some species of cactus. If anyone is keeping their veggie gardens alive under such conditions, I'm very interested in hearing about the experience. Anyway, here's how I help our gardens through the hot and dry season. I want to preface this section by noting that while my setup consists largely of raised beds, I don't think raised beds are necessarily the be all and end all of backyard gardening setups. In fact, if our property wasn't sitting atop what is essentially a giant slab of pure clay, I definitely would have opted for in ground beds, but that's another story for another day. Regardless of whether your gardens are raised beds or in ground, if you live somewhere with hot and dry, or even just dry summers, the deeper your gardens are, the better. The simple reason for this is the deeper you dig, the more moisture there is, even during the hottest parts of the driest summers. My shallowest raised beds are 16 inches deep, and I consider 22 to 24 inches deep to be ideal. Do the roots of common garden plants even grow that deep? Surprisingly, yes. For example, tomato, pepper, and cucumber roots can actually grow to a maximum depth of 48 inches. Broccoli, 36 inches, and winter squashes can go 24 inches. Do they necessarily need beds that will accommodate their maximum root depth? No. That said, the deeper the roots can grow, the less you'll have to water. If growing in containers, large pots are essential. The tomato planted in this 22-inch diameter, 18-inch deep container is thriving after being transplanted 2 weeks ago, in spite of only being watered maybe 2 or 3 times. By contrast, these two bush variety butternut squash in slightly smaller containers have taken a bit of a beating due to repeatedly drying out over the summer. Had it been a little more on top of watering, they would have done a little better, but it's surprisingly easy to let a few containers drop off my radar when life gets busy. Big pots grant a little more margin for error. While I understand the appeal of fabric grow bags, as they allow a gardener to set up a container garden for relatively little money, I've not had great luck with them during the Sacramento summers. The breathable fabric seems to allow soil to dry out so quickly they would require near constant watering to keep plants healthy. This is just impractical. I have heard of some gardeners placing their grow bags in small kiddie pools or large storage totes containing a few inches of water, effectively bottom watering them. However, I've never personally tried this as I'm somewhat concerned the standing water could act as a breeding ground for mosquitoes, which increasingly have been spreading various nasty pathogens in my region. As of now, my remaining grow bags are relegated to the storage of excess mulch soil and compost. This tip really only applies to tomatoes, which will sprout roots from their stems. I like to start my tomatoes indoors under grow lights several weeks before my intended transplant date, harden them off with gradual exposure to outdoor conditions, and finally plant a tomato that is a foot tall or bigger, like this one here. Further, I trim the lower leaves and then bury the root ball in several inches of stem. Doing this encourages a robust and deep running root system that will stay damp and cool even during the worst of the summer. Now, of course, not all garden veggie plants sprout roots from their stems, but transplanting a fairly mature start means you sink the root system deeper than the top few inches of soil, which is most prone to drying. Our 2020 garden was an abysmal failure. I had just built 4 new garden beds and ordered what was touted as a special raised bed soil mix from a local landscape supplier to fill them. This turned out to be a rookie mistake, as a special soil mixture turned out to be low in nutrients in spite of its high cost. A further mistake was failing to mulch. The result was a dry, cracked, sun parched dust bowl of a garden that grew almost nothing. Lesson learned. A good thick mulch layer helps slow evaporation, reducing the need to water, and protects the vital ecosystem in the top few inches of soil from being cooked to death by the sun. Additionally, as the mulch layer decomposes, nutrients are added to the soil. This year I made the somewhat controversial decision to mulch our raised beds with a thick layer of wood mulch. While there are definite pros and cons of wood mulch on the gardens, which I'll elaborate on in a future video, I'm overall very happy with the results. Having applied the mulch layer at the end of a very wet winter seemed to help lock in a lot of that sweet free rain into the soil. I surprisingly didn't have to turn our irrigation system on until we experienced our first major heat wave in mid July. Even then, the watering was a proactive measure as opposed to reactive. Nothing in the garden was showing any signs of water stress. Any number of materials will work as mulch, but it's important to know your source to reduce the likelihood of contamination. Increasingly, straw and hay, 2 traditional mulch materials, are sprayed with persistent broadleaf herbicides that can adversely affect a veggie garden for years. Buyer beware. All right, this one might not be worth the added expense and installation work for small gardens. For my 400 square feet of growable space, however, drip irrigation makes giving the beds an occasional deep watering, which is the most effective watering method for hot, dry climates, far more efficient than broadcast watering with a hose. Most of us have probably seen somewhat intimidating and expensive looking irrigation setups that include programmable timers and other neat looking gadgetry. And while there's nothing wrong with this approach, the cheap and simple setup that I have going is also more than sufficient. My irrigation setup, into which I've sunk less than $200 spread over 3 seasons, consists of a 3/8 inch main line off of which quarter-inch secondary lines link to various emitters. I have these buried under the mulch layer. An adapter couples a standard garden hose to the 3/8 inch main line. This footage from the initial setup of the system this spring shows how simple the whole thing really is. Yeah, installation was a bit tedious and involved way more crouching and kneeling than I like, but overall it wasn't complicated and it was well worth the effort in the end. Unfortunately, since there isn't quite enough water pressure coming onto the property to run a single uninterrupted irrigation line, I had to lay out 5 separate zones. Once I've watered one zone, I have to turn off the water, decouple the hose from the irrigation line, drag it over to the next one, couple the hose to the next zone, and turn on the water again. This admittedly kind of sucks, but the net result is way less time and effort than standing out in the yard with a watering wand for hours at a time. As infrequent deep waterings are more effective than frequent shallow waterings, I run each zone for 30 to 40 minutes once or twice a month during the hottest summer months. Shade cloth was definitely one of our big gardening game changers. While plants obviously need sunlight to live, there can be too much of a good thing. Our backyard, where our garden beds are, faces south, and there isn't much in the area for tree cover. In the summer, the yard gets 12 or more hours per day of intense sunshine. This can lead to issues including the sun scald of leaves and fruit. Tomatoes and peppers seem especially susceptible to sun scald. A 40 to 60% shade cloth, meaning it filters out 40 to 60% of incoming light, really takes the edge off the brutal and unforgiving summer sun. This is good for the plants and the gardener, as working under the shade cloth is far more bearable than out in the open. This year, I decided to go ahead and cover our entire backyard in shade cloth, and I couldn't be happier. I sourced the cloth via Amazon for a total cost of $90. I was a little hesitant to show close up footage of my shade cloth setup, as my haphazard approach reveals my complete lack of engineering talent. My wife and I simply worked the cloth sections over the tops of the trellis supports, securing the edges to lines I ran between support posts at the borders of the garden. Foolishly, I neglected to blunt the tops of the posts, resulting in holes worn in the fabric in numerous places. I'm confident these can be patched, but I'm still kicking myself a bit. Obviously, if I had the time and funds to completely redo my whole garden setup, I'd set up the beds in a manner to allow hoop tunnels for more efficient shade cloth installation. It's important to accept that in a place with hot, dry summers, some veggies just aren't going to thrive during the hotter months. There's no point in wasting time and energy trying to force a round peg into a square hole. Cool weather crops like lettuce, spinach, broccoli, and carrots simply aren't going to make it through a triple digit heat wave. Grow these over winter instead. When growing summer garden staples such as squash, tomatoes, and cucumbers, I recommend selecting varieties of these plants known for their heat tolerance. For example, if standard cucumbers are a struggle, try Armenian cucumbers like these. If your pie pumpkins aren't making it, try butternut squash instead. Need a root veggie fix? Go sweet potato. When it comes to tomatoes, arguably the star of any summer garden, we've had great success with black cherry, sun gold, Cherokee purple, San Marzano, and Rio Grandes. I'm sure this list will grow as we try additional varieties in future years. I'm ending today's video on this little guy right here, the fig eater beetle. The emergence of these cool looking bugs tends to coincide with the arrival of late summer. They're not really friend or foe. The larva can maybe be a borderline pest by occasionally damaging roots, but the adults are said mostly to feed on fruits that are already overripe, fermenting, or damaged. I've never observed them doing any measurable damage to anything we grow. Thanks again for watching. I'm going to try to get a new video up at least every other week, so if you happen to like what I do, stay tuned.